This is Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and we are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. Get ready, everybody, for a frontier examination of the impeachment power in Congress as it relates to Donald J. Trump.
We've got another great program today filled with important information you rarely get anywhere else. First up is New York Times journalist David Enrich, who has written a book entitled Murder the Truth. Murder the Truth is an in-depth expose of the broad campaign orchestrated by elite Americans to repeal the landmark Supreme Court decision Sullivan versus the New York Times. The Sullivan decision argued that the First Amendment limited a public figure's ability to sue a news organization for defamation. This First Amendment protection is coming under attack by right-wing organizations, and Justice Clarence Thomas has hinted that he, for one, is interested in overturning it. With the thin-skinned Trump administration already getting a $15 million settlement out of ABC after the defamation suit, Mr. Enrich is going to let us in on what authoritarian nightmares will come if the Sullivan decision is murdered. Then we turn to taxes. Shadow President Elon Musk has been indiscriminately gutting governmental agencies and the social safety net in the name of saving taxpayer dollars. But it's pretty obvious that he's merely seeding the ground to renew the Trump tax cuts that mainly benefited people like him, the ultra-wealthy. Well, just like the Tesla, Elon did not invent the Antitax Movement. Our second guest today will be Michael Graetz, who has written the book The Power to Destroy: How the Antitax Movement Hijacked America. The book chronicles how the movement originated as a fringe enterprise promoted by zealous outsiders using false economic claims and thinly veiled racist rhetoric, and how it evolved into a mainstream political force. Then finally, as Ralph mentioned, we'll welcome back our resident constitutional scholar Bruce Fein to update us on Impeachment Watch 2025. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, are we going to let our nation's elite murder the truth? David?
David Enrich is the business investigations editor for the New York Times. He writes about the intersection of law and business, including the power wielded by giant corporate law firms and the changing contours of the First Amendment and libel law. His latest book is titled Murder the Truth: Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful, an in-depth expose of the broad campaign orchestrated by elite Americans to overturn 60 years of Supreme Court precedent, weaponize our speech laws, and silence dissent. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, David Enrich.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome indeed, David. I want to read the blurb on the back of the book by Barton Gellman, because I think it goes to the core of your book. He said, quote, "This is the deeply reported, richly narrated story of a war on honest journalism that disturbs the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. David Enrich takes us behind the scenes of a concerted right-wing campaign to destroy news organizations financially. But the ultimate goal is to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan, the linchpin of libel protection for reporters who err in good faith. Nothing less than the future of accountability journalism is at stake," end quote. In your book, you start out describing how the right-wing politicians were champions of free speech. Tell us about that early stage that you described and what caused them, with the ascension of Justice Clarence Thomas and others, to become avatars of censorship.
Well, you're right that for a very long time, there is really, I think, remarkable, near unanimous consensus across the political spectrum that the First Amendment, and in particular, precedents that protected freedom of speech and freedom of the press, like New York Times versus Sullivan, were not only the law of the land, but were rightly the law of the land. And everyone agreed on that because the First Amendment protects speech and protects media, whether it's conservative media, liberal media, mainstream media, whether the news outlet is a large one or a small one, whether the journalist works independently or not. And so I think everyone agreed that even if you don't always like what the other side is saying, that it's important that everyone have the right to express themselves, and that people across the political spectrum have the ability to investigate, scrutinize, criticize what people who hold a lot of power in government, in society, and in the economy are doing. And again, that is something, those are rights that protect right-wing media's ability to investigate a Democratic president and vice versa. So I think for a very long time, there was agreement that New York Times versus Sullivan was kind of this cherished cornerstone of our democracy. And that began to change around the time that Donald Trump came onto the political scene. And he, in a central part of his campaign back in 2016 and his presidency back in 2016 and now continuing to this day, is to promote an agenda that is underpinned often, not always, but often, by lies and distortions and conspiracy theories. And so having a vigorous, independent, probing media that's going to refute those lies and distortions, I think appeared to pose a threat to Trump and his allies' ability to enact their agenda. And it's around that time that Clarence Thomas took his first kind of public swing at New York Times versus Sullivan, arguing that it was wrongly decided back in 1964, not because of any of the real substance of the case at hand, but because in his reading of the 45 words of the First Amendment, he didn't see any indication that libelous speech was supposed to be protected by the framers of the Constitution. And so he wanted to overturn it. The bottom line is that it had come to protect, among many other things, it had come to protect the right of journalists to do investigative journalism and to try and ferret out official secrets and to hold the most powerful people and institutions in this country to account. And oftentimes the target of those investigations were people like Clarence Thomas, people like Donald Trump. And I think they took umbrage and offense at much of what the media was doing in that space and thought that their lives and their worldviews would be safer and more protected if it was harder for the media to publish investigations like that, and if it were easier for powerful public figures like Clarence Thomas, like Donald Trump, like many others, to successfully sue the media into submission when they started doing big, ambitious investigations. So this case goes back to 1960, when the New York Times ran a full-page ad that was paid for by supporters of Martin Luther King. And the ad, it was basically a fundraising appeal, trying to raise money for like voter registration drives in the South and to pay for the legal defense of King and his allies. And so this ad, it was titled "Heed Their Rising Voices." And it contained a lot of small print text that was detailing this litany of abuses that officials across the South had taken as they tried to suppress the civil rights movement and preserve white supremacy. And it detailed a lot of the kind of violent and Stalinist tactics that officials were using. None of these officials were mentioned by name, but among others, the Montgomery, Alabama Police Department was singled out for criticism because of its violent history and the extreme lengths it was going to keep Black people down, essentially. So L.B. Sullivan was at the time one of the 3 city commissioners in Montgomery, Alabama, and he had responsibility for the city's police force. And even though he was not named in the ad, he took great umbrage at the criticism that the New York Times had leveled, and he decided to sue the Times for having defamed him, again, even though he was not mentioned in the ad. And this was part of a broader campaign by Southern officials like Sullivan to use exactly this kind of defamation lawsuit to basically deter national news outlets like the Times, but also like the big broadcasters, from covering the civil rights movement. And the goal was that if they can kind of raise the cost of doing business in the South by suing all the time, that will scare journalists away. And Sullivan's argument was based on the fact that the Times ad, while the gist of it was completely true, there were a few details that were either wrong or exaggerated. And so he claimed that those wrong or exaggerated details constituted defamation. And so he sued. The case went to trial in an Alabama courtroom that was presided over by a white supremacist judge. And it was a segregated courtroom. Some of the jurors showed up to court wearing Confederate battle costumes and with actual real guns. And you will not be surprised to hear that the jury fairly quickly returned a verdict in favor of L.B. Sullivan and against the New York Times. And the jury awarded damages of $500,000, which does not sound like a lot, but it was a lot more at the time. And the New York Times was operating on kind of a financial knife's edge. This and other similar suits posed a real existential threat to the Times, which then, because of that threat, decided to pull its reporters out of Alabama, and it discouraged its reporters from writing about things such as Alabama's kind of institutionalized racism. Anyway, the Times appealed the verdict. The state Supreme Court rejected the appeal, which left the U.S. Supreme Court as a one last hope. And in 1964, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. And after a few months, they issued a really stunning decision. It was unanimous, and it overturned the Alabama courts and ruled against Sullivan and for the New York Times. And the rationale of the ruling was that basically it's really important in our country to have a media that vigorously investigates and criticizes people in power. And if reporters don't have the breathing room to occasionally get some facts wrong in the course of interrogating public officials, and if they worry that an innocent mistake or two is going to subject them to possibly ruinous litigation, people will start to censor themselves, and they will shy away from writing about litigious and powerful people in the public domain. And that's really bad for democracy. And so the Supreme Court in this case established what's come to be known as the actual malice standard, which is a little bit of a misnomer because it does not involve what you or I would normally think of as malice, like someone being mean or wanting to hurt someone. Instead, it means it's basically creating a very high bar for public figures and public officials to win defamation lawsuits. And so the standard is that in order to win, if you are a public figure or public official, you need to prove not only that the facts at issue were wrong and that they actually injured your reputation, but also that whoever wrote these defamatory falsehoods either did so knowingly, in other words, that they lied, or that they acted with reckless disregard for the accuracy of what they were saying. So again, that was a high bar. The Supreme Court knew it was a high bar. Everyone knew it was a high bar, but it was set so high by design because it wanted to give space, to give breathing room to journalists and others, including members of the public, to kind of vigorously look into the affairs and debate freely without fear of litigation what the most powerful people in government, in the economy, in society were doing.
Well, in your book, you described where Dominion and another company sued Fox News and Fox News lost.
Fox News in the 2020 election and other right-wing news outlets have been peddling all of these falsehoods about, obviously, whether Joe Biden had won or lost the election. And one of the claims that Fox and many of its hosts and guests repeatedly made, which were false, was that Dominion Voting Systems and another voting company that basically make the software and make the machines on which many people in many states vote, the people on Fox were claiming falsely that the voting machines were rigged by Dominion and another company, Smartmatic, that in order to hand Joe Biden the presidency and to defeat unfairly Donald Trump. So Dominion and Smartmatic each sued Fox and a few other right-wing news networks and anchors and guests on those shows and said, you were knowingly spreading falsehoods. That is, in other words, a lie. And you have greatly damaged our businesses. So we are going to sue you. And the interesting thing was that Fox and these other right-wing outlets for years had been kind of banging the drum against New York Times versus Sullivan and against the protections that many journalists have come to count on. And then they get sued, and their immediate fallback is to very happily cite New York Times versus Sullivan and say, look, we didn't know we were getting facts wrong. It was inadvertent. We were kind of parroting what the president was saying, and surely we have the right to quote accurately what Donald Trump or any other president is saying. And look, again, we weren't lying. We had good reason to believe what we were saying was true. Therefore, you cannot win the suit. And what actually happened was that Dominion pushed forward with this lawsuit. Judges allowed it to move forward into the discovery stage, where upon getting access to Fox's internal emails and like chat messages and things like that, it became clear that they knew that what they were saying was false. They were talking internally about how they were lying and allowing liars to talk about Dominion and Smartmatic, even though lawyers for Dominion and Smartmatic had repeatedly and explicitly over and over in writing warned Fox and others that what they were saying were lies. And so you could get to see inside of Fox, they knew that these were lies and they didn't care because it was good for their ratings. And so The case never went to trial. And right before the trial was set to begin, Fox agreed to pay Dominion just under $800 million, which is one of the biggest libel payouts in US history. And to me, and I think to a lot of people who believe in the First Amendment, this was really evidence that even with the high bar that Sullivan and other Supreme Court cases have erected that make it understandably make it difficult for public figures or public officials to win libel suits, here is Dominion, which for the purposes of this lawsuit was a public figure because it was an important and public company. They were able to clear that bar because Fox was lying, and they were able to hold Fox accountable to the tune of, I think, $787 million. So to me and others, I think it was a resounding rebuttal to this notion that New York Times versus Sullivan makes it impossible to hold liars to account. Fox and its employees and its guests were liars. Their lies were damaging, and they were forced to pay a huge financial penalty as a result.
Tell us about Trump, his lawsuits. He intends to make more lawsuits against media outlets. He's got power over the media, like you mentioned in Disney owning ABC.
Well, look, long before he ever campaigned for president, was a serial filer of garbage defamation lawsuits against anyone who insulted him, criticized him, questioned his net worth. And with, as far as I can tell, with one exception where a defendant just failed to show up in court, he lost every single one of those cases. And so he arrived on the campaign trail in 2016 and started talking about opening up the country's libel laws to make it easier for people like him to sue the media. And of course, that's not something the president or Congress can do. That's a question of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment. But Trump spent much of his first term and then the intervening years bashing the media, trying to, I think, tank the media's credibility so that it would not be a viable check on his power if he returned to office. And since then, since the election, he has, and as you said, he's filed lawsuits, his lawyers have sent threats, and he's trying to create, it seems like, a climate in which news outlets really have to think about whether they are going to get sued by the president or his allies, or whether they're going to come under some other kind of investigation by the federal government as a result of critical coverage. And I think what we've seen in the past couple of months since the election and since Trump took office, these are just early days. And we've already seen some very clear, concrete warning signs that this is Trump and his allies see libel lawsuits and threats and other legal actions as well as totally legitimate weapons to deploy against the media. And so, there have been defamation lawsuits and threats. There's also been, he's used a kind of new legal strategy or newer legal strategy in the case they filed against CBS News and also one against the Des Moines Register in Iowa, where he's not arguing that he has been defamed. He's arguing that because those news outlets produced coverage that he did not agree with or like, and that in one case turned out to be inaccurate, that essentially violates state consumer protection laws that are supposed to protect against things like false advertising. And, let's just say, I don't know how deep you want to go on this, but that's an interpretation of those state laws that runs counter to the legislature's intent when they pass the laws. It runs counter to how courts have interpreted the laws, and it runs directly in the face of the First Amendment. And yet, this is the president of the United States, and especially with the CBS lawsuit that's pending in Texas, and he's got a friendly federal judge in Texas whom he appointed in his first term. And he's also got his guys running the Federal Communications Commission, which not only has veto power over the planned merger involving CBS's parent company, but also has control over the broadcast licenses that CBS and its affiliates rely on to air their shows. And so there's a huge amount of leverage that Trump has that could potentially, kind of when you're doing a cost-benefit analysis here, it could really change the calculus for a company like CBS because of the great power that the Trump administration wields. And that's something that if Trump were not president, he would not have that power at his disposal. And I think it's, as far as I know, I cannot think of an example, maybe with the exception of Nixon, where a president considered it fair game and appropriate to use those levers of power that are at its disposal. It's not just happening at the national level. These threats and these lawsuits have become an extremely popular weapon among everyone from the president down to mayors, city council members, local real estate development companies, on and on and on. And they're a weapon it's a very effective weapon, because you do not need to win a defamation lawsuit against a local journalist or a small news outlet or an independent publisher in order for the lawsuit or the threats to be effective. You simply dragging someone through years of expensive legal motions and maybe discovery and depositions and things like that, it can push smaller outlets and independent journalists over the financial edge. It's a serious problem that's happening, often kind of beneath the radar, that is threatening to put independent journalism, community journalism out of business. And the direct result of that will be that powerful people, companies, organizations, institutions are going to be able to do bad things without anyone knowing about it.
You end the book, David Enrich, with a rather foreboding paragraph. And the last sentence, you refer to Associate Justice of the Supreme Court Clarence Thomas, and you say, quote, Thomas is ascendant on a staunchly conservative court that has shown its willingness to toss long-standing precedents out the window. The media is still tormenting him, but now he and his colleagues might just be able to do something about it, end quote. Meaning, overturn the key bulwark of Sullivan versus New York Times. Is that what you meant?
Yeah. I mean, it's that, or I think I don't know how many votes there are right now to overturn Sullivan outright, but I think a more likely and short-term scenario or medium-term scenario is that the court takes a case that basically makes it easier for public figures, not public officials, but public figures, so like a billionaire or a big company, to bring and win defamation suits. And so essentially chipping away at Sullivan without attacking it or overturning it outright. And even a half step like that, though, I mean, it could have huge implications for the ability of journalists and members of the public to be critical about, the local real estate development company that we're talking about, or a Citigroup of the world. So, I mean, I think even a small blow to the several Sullivan-related precedents that are out there could have a huge impact on the ability of journalists to do their job, and make it much easier for companies, large and small, to cover up misconduct and avoid accountability.
We're out of time, David. Is there any last point you want to make before we conclude to our listeners? What you'd like them to do?
I have an assignment for them, which is do a little reading about New York Times versus Sullivan. Do a little reading. I mean, you could buy my book. That would be one way to do it. But also I think it's important. People keep asking me what they can do, what they should do. And I think the answer is really to try and understand these issues. They're complicated, but they're also getting deliberately misframed and misrepresented often, especially on the right, but sometimes not on the right. And I think it's really important for people to understand the importance of New York Times versus Sullivan, and to understand the grave threats facing journalists, especially at the local level right now, and the consequences that could have for our democracy. And I feel like the more people learn about this and understand it in a sophisticated way, the better off we'll all be.
A good start, listeners, is to read David Enrich's new book, Murder the Truth, Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. David is a very accurate, engaging storyteller. So it's a gripping book, not just a revelatory book. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with David Enrich. We will link to his new book, Murder the Truth, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, how the anti-tax movement is threatening the nation's social safety net, increasing inequality, ballooning the national debt, and sapping America's financial strength. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, March 21, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Ahead of last week's Senate confirmation hearing for Dr. Mehmet Oz to lead the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, Public Citizen released a new research brief shining a light on the hundreds of millions of dollars Medicare Advantage companies have spent on lobbying. If Oz is confirmed as the CMS administrator, attacks on traditional Medicare are likely to move into overdrive, said Egan Kemp of Public Citizen. We should strengthen Medicare by improving it and expanding access to it, not weaken it through further privatization. Since their inception in 2003, Medicaid Advantage plans are estimated to have cost taxpayers more than $600 billion in overpayments. These overpayments are expected to grow to $1 trillion over the next decade. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Is the anti-tax movement holding America hostage? David?
Michael Graetz is professor emeritus at Columbia Law School and Yale Law School and a leading authority on tax politics and policy. He served in the United States Treasury's Office of Tax Policy and is the author and co-author of many books, including Death by a Thousand Cuts, The Fight Over Taxing Inherited Wealth, and The Burger Court and the Rise of the Judicial Right. His latest book is The Power to Destroy, How the Anti-Tax Movement Hijacked America. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Michael Graetz.
Thank you, David.
Welcome indeed, Michael. And if the American people and their Congress listened to Michael Graetz over the years, we'd have a much better political economy, to be sure. But let's start with your premise here. I want to quote a paragraph from the beginning of your book, and I quote, "The modern anti-tax movement is the most overlooked social and political movement in recent American history. It has impeded the nation's ability to protect its people from the vicissitudes of life, produced massive public debt, and contributed to the country's exceptional inequality. Like all social movements, some anti-tax protagonists have acted out of self-interest, others out of the deep-seated ideological commitments. Many have been motivated by both," end quote. Well, let's talk about how successful they were in recent decades to describe the present situation, and then we'll go right to the contemporary drive by Trump to engage in even more tax cuts tilted to the wealthy and major corporations' benefits.
Sure. I think that the book is important in describing the anti-tax movement as a social and political movement. I spent a lot of time asking people to name the most important political and social movements of the last half century, and no surprise, they name the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, the Christian evangelical movement, the MAGA movement lately, but no one ever mentioned the anti-tax movement. And unlike the other movements I've named, the anti-tax movement is really the only one that has not suffered a serious setback in the past half century. That is, it started in the mid-'70s, late 70s with the enactment of Proposition 13 in California, and it continues, as you suggest, Ralph, today with the extension of the Trump tax cuts that were enacted in 2017. The other thing I would say, just to set the stage, is that on the Republican side, and it's important to note that the Democrats have been conspirators, co-conspirators in the anti-tax movement, which we can talk about if you like. But on the Republican side, there are three claims that are very important to their tax policy. All of them have been disproven, and they conflict. The first is that cutting taxes will always raise government revenues. These are claims, as you know, grounded in Arthur Laffer's famous curve on which he put no numbers carefully. But even in 2017, the Secretary of the Treasury was claiming that the Trump tax cuts of the first administration would raise revenue, and that has never happened. The second claim is that lowering taxes will necessarily starve the beast. This was an idea of Milton Friedman's, who suggested that if you lower taxes, the government will have to cut spending. But as you know, what we've done instead is we've increased debt at the federal level. And so these two ideas are not only in conflict, that is, you're either going to raise revenue or starve the beast, but you're not going to do both. But neither one of them is true. They've both been proven false over a half century of evidence. And then the third thing to say, which goes to the point that you read about inequality, is that when the supply-siders intervened into a vacuum that was created in the 1970s through stagflation, where Keynesian economics, which had claimed that you can have either unemployment or inflation, but not both at the same time, was proven wrong on that important claim. And there was a vacuum, and the supply-siders then became the important force in the anti-tax movement. And their main premise is that the way to stimulate an economy, the way to grow the nation's economy, is to reduce taxes at the top. And that means that you have to lower taxes on capital. If you're going to raise taxes, you should raise them on labor. And there's been an enormous shift from taxes on capital to taxes on labor.
Let me point out to our listeners how important this point you just made is. The label they use to justify tax cuts for the rich and the corporate, they call them the job creators. Well, that has not been proven at all, especially in the Reagan administration. But talk about this propaganda that every time they talk about tax cuts for the wealthy, they use the word job creators to describe them.
Well, absolutely. They treat anybody who's holding stock in a public corporation a, quote, job creator on the grounds that they can lower taxes on dividends, just to take a specific example from recent history. But the bigger point, which I think is also underlying this claim, Ralph, that you're describing, is that the anti-tax movement has always relied on a false dichotomy between us, those who pay taxes, and them, those who receive government benefits. And this has often been done with racial overtones, something that my book really spends a lot of time talking about. And so we saw it with Howard Jarvis very effectively when California lowered its property taxes for homeowners and big commercial enterprises. And we saw it more recently when Mitt Romney said that there were 47% of the people who would always vote for Obama because they depended on government, and ignored the fact that they were paying very high Social Security taxes on their wages. So this effort to distinguish between the so-called job creators and the average worker, or us and them, us who pay taxes and them who don't, has been a hallmark of the anti-tax movement since its inception.
And distinguish between earned income and unearned income. Even Ronald Reagan didn't think that taxes on capital gains from selling stock should be lower than ordinary income taxation. But now we have a real gap. The electrician or plumber, carpenter goes to work, earns money, fairly good money, can pay a much higher rate of taxation than a billionaire who is selling stock for profit, say ExxonMobil pays. Can you describe that dichotomy? I've often thought that making money from money that is taxed lower than making money from hard work leads to concentration of power, because it's sort of unfair when a venture capital buys up doctors' offices with money that they made from money compared to someone who wants to buy that cardiology office making money from hard work. That's a new kind of inequality. Can you elaborate and give some numbers on the difference between taxes on unearned income and earned income?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. As you pointed out, during the Reagan administration in 1986, Congress, with his support, treated capital gains and ordinary income the same. But beginning really with the George W. Bush administration in 2001, the tax on capital gains was lowered initially to 15%. It's now 20% under the income tax. And if you're in a high enough bracket, you may pay 23.8% on your capital gains. But one of the important points here, which is often ignored, is that you don't have to ever pay taxes on capital gains if you're clever. ProPublica demonstrated, based on a lot of tax return information that they got, that most of the billionaires and 100 millionaires in the country, people with $100 million or more, basically can live off of borrowed funds. They just put their assets up for collateral. They borrow, pay no tax on the funds that they use and spend on consumption or whatever they're buying. And so they're paying zero. And then if they hold the assets until death, they never pay the capital gains tax. So often, instead of the 23% rate that may apply, they're paying zero, which I think is an important point when you're thinking about the difference. The doctor that you mentioned can pay up to 37% now on ordinary labor income, plus taxes on Social Security on the first $175,000 or so that he or she earns, which would be another 12.3%, plus a 3.9% Medicare tax on all of their income. all of their labor income. So labor income can be taxed well over 50% in circumstances where capital gains can be taxed at zero.
See, listeners, it's even worse than we think. These people who don't pay any taxes are called job creators, and you out there that pay the bulk of the taxes and can't engage in evasions and avoidances the way the corporations and super rich can, you're the real taxpayers, and you're not bragging about it and using it as a political force. So now we have Donald Trump's going to propose his tax cuts to the Republican toadies on Capitol Hill, and he's going to try to sweeten the pot for ordinary people by not taxing tips and, as he says, not taxing Social Security benefits. Describe that maneuver.
Well, so the Donald Trump tax cuts that were enacted in 2017 were made permanent for large corporations where the rate was cut from 35% to 21%, and other changes were made. But they were made temporary because they had to meet a budget requirement that said that the total tax cuts at that time would only cost $1.5 trillion, which is a lot over 10 years. And there is a rule in the Senate that says that if you're going to increase deficits after the 10-year period, then you have to make the tax cuts expire. And in order to meet their $1.5 trillion limit, the Republicans, and the 2017 Act was a pure Republican bill, no Democrat voted for it. The Republicans basically had every cut for the individuals that they had enacted end at the end of 2025 within the budget window as a way to hold the cost down. What they're doing now is that at least based on what the head of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Mike Graetz, wants to do, is to pretend that it's costless to extend all of these tax cuts, even though every estimate is that just extending the Trump tax cuts will add $4.5 to $5 trillion to the nation's debt over the next decade. So they're going to cost $4.5 or $5 trillion, but the Congress is now positioning itself to pretend that extending those cuts costs nothing. And they're going to do this through a process known as reconciliation, which allows them to do it with 50 votes rather than the 60 they would need to block a filibuster in the Senate. And so that's where they're positioned, and the House has passed a budget reconciliation that would allow the tax writing committees to basically come up with somewhere between $2.5 and $4.5 trillion of tax cuts. And if they assume, as they seem to want to be able to do as a way of fooling the American people, that extending the 2017 cuts are somehow costless, then they'll have another $2.5 to $4 trillion to spend on Trump's campaign proposals, which, as you point out, Ralph, include not taxing tips and not taxing overtime, which you didn't mention. And he has also made a proposal to eliminate the income tax on Social Security benefits, which applies to about 85% now of Social Security recipients. The Social Security change, I just want to make one point about that, may not be eligible to be enacted through reconciliation, because there is a rule that says that if you do anything that affects the trust funds, the Social Security Trust Fund in particular, that means that you cannot do it through reconciliation, but you need 60 votes in the Senate. The idea is to squeeze as many more tax cuts into the forthcoming legislation as they can get away with.
Well, you know, you're not just a scholar. We're talking with Michael Graetz, the author of the book, The Power to Destroy: How the Antitax Movement Hijacked America. But you've had experience in the Treasury Department. You've been on advisory committees to various government entities. And so I want to take this experience of yours in Washington, D.C., and put the following. I've been impressed over the years by the power of Grover Norquist, who I've communicated with often. He allegedly is against corporate welfare, subsidies, handouts, giveaways, bailouts, and I actually shared a press conference with him on that subject. But he invited me to one of his Wednesday noon meetings in a jammed room at his office. And I walked in, and they were just literally hanging from the rafters. These are all the people who take his marching orders. And after he feeds them lunch, he barks out, "You got to call this senator. You got to get a hold of this vice presidential office assistant. Call the White House. Call the conservative media." And so it came my time to speak. I got up and I said, "I've never been in a room so full of greed." I said, "You guys could freeze ice." The greed, the singularity, the militancy totally overwhelms the weakness of the resistance by liberal groups, a tiny little group called Citizens for Tax Justice in Washington, and by the Democratic Party.
I debated Grover Norquist once at the 21 Club over a couple of drinks and a good audience, and I've interviewed Grover. Grover was described as the single most effective conservative activist in the country by 60 Minutes. Now, Arianna Huffington calls him the dark wizard of the anti-tax cult, which I think is, in some ways, both are right. But he has a pledge, as you know, Ralph, which has now been signed by more than 1,800 Republicans, and it basically promises never, ever to increase taxes, no matter what the economic or financial circumstances of the government are. And it also requires that if you close a tax loophole, you have to reduce taxes somewhere else. So you can't reduce the deficit simply by closing tax loopholes. I mean, even Donald Trump wants to close the tax loophole on so-called carried interest, where managers of hedge funds and private equity groups pay capital gains taxes instead of ordinary income taxes. And Grover has been unbelievably effective. His Wednesday meetings, as you point out, which are not only conducted in Washington as part of the anti-tax, anti-government movement, but are also conducted in state houses all over the country now on Wednesdays, have been extremely effective in organizing people who, as Grover says, all want government so small they'll drown it in a bathtub. You've heard him say that many times. And so this is a massive and well-organized anti-government movement. And as you point out, there is no counter-movement on the left. When Hillary Clinton was running for president, she said, basically, "I wish we had a movement that was as effective as Grover's movement." And the Democrats do not. But I have to say, as you know, getting the Democrats to effectively oppose some of the things that are going on is a problem. And the Democrats are co-conspirators here in the following sense. That is, over time, this goes back to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's pledge during the 2008 campaign. But over time, the Democrats have become allies in the anti-tax movement. And so you know, Ralph, that Joe Biden insisted that he would never, ever raise taxes on anybody with less than $400,000 of income. And so the Democrats now don't want to tax 98% of the people, and the Republicans don't want to tax 100% of the people. And the question is, how do you get anywhere with those kinds of firm no new taxes pledges? And that's a problem. And I think it's a problem that the Democrats have fallen into, basically based on the success of the Republicans' anti-tax coalition.
Now, you mentioned a secret tax. Listeners, just remember, the Republicans and Democrats don't care about the massive deficits and interest payments that your children and grandchildren are going to be burdened by, in addition to the distortions of the federal budget, which, Michael, you can elaborate on beautifully. Go ahead.
Well, the federal debt now is 100% of the size of the economy, which it has never been before since the end of World War II. And at the end of World War II, the U.S. had all the money there was. The U.S. was poised to grow its economy for years at an unprecedented pace, and to do so in a way that spread the wealth quite widely. Europe and Japan were in a shambles. They were both destroyed during the World War. And China was beginning to enter into a dark communist period, and that is not the situation today. So interest on the federal debt is now close to $1 trillion a year, close to $1 trillion a year. It is the fastest growing expenditure in the federal budget, with the exception today of Social Security because of all the baby boom retirees. But it's growing faster than defense, faster than Medicare, faster than Medicaid, faster than anything else. And 30 to 35 cents of every dollar that we spend on the federal debt is going abroad. sometimes to our friends, but often to people and countries that we think are not necessarily our friends. And the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the debt will grow over the next decade, and they assume that the Trump tax cuts will expire, which they know to be a foolish assumption, but they are required by law to make that assumption. They assume that the interest on the federal debt over the next decade will hit over 4% of the size of the economy. And they also assume that the economy is going to grow at about 2%. So that means that we've got a huge hole. We're digging it more and more deeply every year. And the interest on the federal debt is going to grow at about twice the rate as the economy is going to grow. And this is a recipe, in my opinion, for disaster. The question is what form disaster will take.
How does it affect ordinary people's public services and public budgets?
Well, it's a terrific point, Ralph. I mean, it's crowding out the ability of the federal government to do the things that people want it to do. This is why the Republicans are now talking about cutting, one of the reasons why they're talking about cutting Medicaid. That is the one thing that has to be paid is the interest on the federal debt. And the only way to reduce it is to start getting serious about reducing federal deficits and paying off the debt. And we have not been serious about that since the George W. Bush administration at the beginning of this century. So it's crowding out other things that the government might do, that the government often thinks that the government needs to do. It's threatening health care for individuals around the country who are getting their health care subsidized or provided by the government, depending on whether you've got Medicare or Medicaid, or whether you're covered by the Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare provisions. And so you're going to see individuals' budgets pinched because the federal government refuses to treat its budget with any degree of seriousness.
In the last few minutes discussion, listeners, this would never have had to be discussed with Michael if the Democrats had held on to the House of Representatives. And they blew an opportunity to beat some of the worst, most vulnerable Republican candidates who are against minimum wage increase, against regulation of health and safety, against all kinds of very popular agendas, which the Democrats never resurrected from the history of the New Deal. And they didn't even make a major issue to restore the child tax credit, which gave about $300 a month to over 60 million kids in both conservative and Republican and liberal families. How's that for a vote getter and reduce child poverty? So here we are, a margin of 3 or 4 seats in the House is making this Trump tax cut possible. Whereas if the Democrats controlled the House, he could never get it through. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely correct. Although one point I think is worth making, which is that when Joe Biden was president and had a Democratic House and Senate, he proposed a whole litany of tax increases on people he called, millionaires and billionaires, but they were really people with 100 million, not just a million. And in 2022, when he got a few tax increases on large corporations, a Democratic Congress refused to do any of those things. And so raising taxes on anybody has become very difficult. Although your point, Ralph, which is that you could stop some of the additional bleeding and additional digging of these holes that the federal government has with a Democratic House, is correct. And it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to stop anything under the current circumstances. So I agree with you entirely that a Democratic House would have stopped a lot of the nonsense that we're about to see, costly nonsense, I might add. But even a Democratic Congress doesn't want to raise taxes.
People out there, get this book, The Power to Destroy, How the Antitax Movement Hijacked America, and I might add, and the American people. Give it to a library, discuss it in your book clubs, because don't let the jargon overcome you. Michael Graetz writes in plain English. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Ralph, and thanks to Steve and David and Hannah.
We've been speaking with Michael Graetz. We will link to his book, The Power to Destroy, at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Stand up, stand up.
So, what's the latest on impeachment? David?
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and an expert on international law. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Bruce. As we're conversing, a serious series of crises are occurring under the onrushing installation of the Trump-Musk fascist dictatorship. There's no other way to describe it, in all directions, in defiance of court orders. And you have said that there's one tool left that Trump cannot eliminate, and that is the impeachment power of the U.S. Congress, which, if he is impeached in the House and convicted and removed in the Senate, cannot be appealed to the courts, is self-executing. So take it from there.
Certainly the current Congress is not going to act without citizen involvement, pressure, clamoring that they do something to save the processes which are the heart and soul of our civilization as opposed to the law of the jungle. So what that means is that if we expect the impeachment power to be awakened, it's really in the hands of everyone on this program, ourselves, write-in, town hall meetings. We care about process. We care about making sure that the rule of law and not the rule of men obtains. That I said, and it works. I was involved in Watergate, as Ralph was. 30,000 telegrams came in after the Saturday Night Massacre, and they kept streaming into Congress and the White House until President Nixon surrendered the White House tapes and complied with the rule of law. So those are the essential elements here. Now, I think of all the alarms that have been sent off by, I call it the Trump-Musk Doomvrit. It's kind of a dual dictatorship, if you will. I mean, the most flagrant ones are his effort to flout the law. And that is, in one case, it was TikTok, where he said, I'm just not going to enforce the law, at least for 75 days, maybe longer, even though Article 2, Section 3 says you have an obligation to faithfully execute the law, not sabotage the law. He issues an executive order saying there's no longer birthright citizenship, even though it's been enshrined in Section 3 of 14th Amendment for over 150 years and understood to mean that anyone who's born in the United States and complies with the laws is a U.S. citizen. And then we also have the thunder that hasn't quite struck yet, indicating that at some point, and it may be sooner than later, he's going to flout a court order that he declares himself is erroneous, even though that obviously involves a conflict of interest if he's judging the correctness of his own legal evaluation.
This may be too much for the Roberts Court, which shows signs of getting nervous over what power they gave Trump last June to engage in criminal activity as long as it was in his official capacity and be immune to any prosecution. Could you talk about your articles, and then we'll talk about how to get them introduced in the House of Representatives?
First, he has flouted laws that clearly give him no room for discretion. For example, the Supreme Court has held when Congress appropriates money, unless they rescind it under the Impoundment Control Act, the president must spend it. And yet the president is refusing to spend billions of dollars that Congress has appropriated. He's never gone to Congress and asked for them to rescind it. Those are multiple impeachable offenses. He's refused to comply with the TikTok law. He's flouted our Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. In my judgment, he's also flouted the domestic and foreign emoluments clauses, in that he has organized his business practices, which he hasn't walked away from, in a way that everybody knows that if you want to get a favor from President Trump, you need to patronize his businesses. That's true if you're on the domestic side or the foreign side. And so you'll pay $1,500 to $2,000 a day for his hotels or whatever business enterprise he enters into. And the whole reason for these clauses is try to make sure that a president during his incumbency is focused only on what's good for the United States. He's not going to be deflected by his financial interests. And then we have just his open statements alone stating that he is urging impeachment of judges who disagree with Mr. Trump's interpretation of the law, which is an attempt to underscore or flout the independence of the judicial branch. And also, he's flouted what we understand the oversight powers of Congress. He does not share, none of what he's doing is transparent. And he actually has Mr. Musk operating without Senate confirmation, but exercising more authority than cabinet officials have. So he's running basically an illegal, off-the-charts operation, trying to slash and destroy government without anyone who's been properly confirmed. those are kind of a sample of the overall level, I think, of lawlessness that justifies the impeachment and removal. I want to add, Ralph, that I think there is some signs that this issue could be jumped to the front of the queue, impeachment, because I'm reading the tea leaves here. I do believe that the likelihood is more than 50-50 that Trump will violate a court order saying that you can't use the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to deport Venezuelans when we don't have a declaration of war or an actual invasion by Venezuela, as the express language requires. And I think that case is going to get to the Supreme Court. We kind of had a trial run or dress rehearsal a few weeks ago when a 5-4 majority on the liberal side refused to stay a court order requiring Mr. Trump to spend money that had been appropriated by Congress. It was 5-4. Chief Justice Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett voted with the liberals. And I think we could see that repeating itself within the next weeks.
Well, on that point, we have to conclude, and I can say to our listeners, communicate with your senators and representatives and remind them of what our founding fathers did to put the impeachment power exclusively in the hands of Congress. They did not want another King George III, and Donald J. Trump, the madman in the White House, for whom the rule of law means nothing except to violate it from the Constitution to federal statutes, is making King George III look modest by comparison. He is seizing power at a terrifying daily rate, and he's not afraid to back it with armed force, as in a police state. Thank you very much, Bruce Fein. As always, to be continued.
Thank you.
I want to thank our guests again, David Enrich, Michael Graetz, and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material. We got plenty of it in the wrap-up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. That's right, he's back, folks. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. You got to get involved. You know, when all the institutions are crushed by a dictator in the White House, it's only the people that can save the people. And it doesn't take that many.
Listen